When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers!
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Fashion Emergency Hotline.
Help! I hate everything I own. It's all so dated, and I have over 10,000 followers waiting to see my summer style.
Where are you calling from?
My closet.
Deep breaths. You need to go to Old Navy.
Old Navy?
Yep, now through Monday, all tees, tanks, shorts, and swim are 50% off.
50% off?
Yeah, stock up on never basic tees and tanks, cute shorts, and flattering swimwear in a variety of styles and colors, all 50% off. Then watch your new followers roll in.
Oh, thank you.
Don't thank me. Thank Old Navy. Valid 5/23 to 5/30. Exclusions.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello, and welcome to the Race Haven Podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race in America. My name is Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 13 of Race Haven, and today I am joined by 2 regular contributors to the dialogue, Mr. Montoya Smith and Mr. John Costino. Montoya Smith is the founder of the Mental Dialogue community, and John Costino is the founder and CEO of MoneyWise LLC. Montoya, how are you today?
I'm doing well, brother.
Thanks for joining me. Looking forward to the dialogue with you today. And John, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Scott. Good morning to both you and Montoya.
Good morning, John, as well.
Well, I'm glad that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just saying I'm driving, so I'm trying to get to a spot. Hope it ain't too bad in the background.
Oh, you sound good right now, so
okay,
hopefully it'll stay that way.
Okay, yeah, I should be set location here pretty soon, so sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. So I appreciate both of you joining me again. The 3 of us got together for episode 12, and where we left off on a topic that I wanted to bring right back for our listeners and for us to kind of go deeper on. So I'm excited about that today. So today we're going to dialogue about the title of today's show is what I like to say is a lack of personal responsibility versus the concept of systemic racism in America. Okay, and then we're going to close out with our solution segment where we do our best to suggest solutions to the topics we address during the show. But before we dive deep into that, first I want to give a little background on dialogue because I think it's very important and it's something I like to do before every show. There's a book called Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together by William Isaacs. William Isaacs is a member of a team at MIT that in the 90s, along with Peter Senge, they work with a lot of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 corporations around the country and using a concept called learning organizations, and they use systems thinking as well as the art of authentic dialogue to solve major issues within companies and corporations. And by having these companies take on these concepts, companies had major turnarounds and it improved viability and success. So while studying these things and reading these things, I immediately saw the connection and how it can improve social issues as well. And these gentlemen in their work discuss these things as well about not only can these theories and concepts work in the corporate world, but they also can work in the social world. One of the most famous books, a worldwide bestseller that was written by Peter Senge, is called The Fifth Discipline, which I recommend to anyone who's leading any organization, as well as Dialogue and the Art of Thinking by William Isaacs. So one of the main things I like to do is contrast the concept of dialogue with the concept of debate. And there's one that I shared last week, and I typically try to share a different one each week. But I really want to come back to this one that I shared last week because, in our interactions that we have in our Facebook group, I realize this is something really, really hard for people to really grasp because we're not brought up this way. We're brought up to be competitive, and we're brought up to try to win. And that carries over into our communication. And one of the key tenets of dialogue is this. In dialogue, one submits one's best thinking, expecting that others people's reflections will help improve it rather than threaten it. So let me just highlight that really quick because a lot of times when we put forth our best thinking, we kind of put it out there like it's right and we want other people to accept it versus expecting other people's reflections and thoughts and ideas to actually help improve on it and not feel threatened by that. That's something that's so challenging, and it's something that can be, again, implemented into our daily lives in our work world and in our social world. If we can learn to communicate through dialogue, I think that we could all solve problems quicker and become better communicators. So to contrast that, in debate, one submits one's best thinking and defends it against challenge to show that it is right. And that's something that I see, again, because of the way we were all raised and kind of the norms in our society is that, we put our best thinking out there and then we defend it. Okay, because we were on debate teams or we were taught to debate in school and things like that. So dialogue can be counterintuitive. However, there's been so much research done and through my reading that I understand, I can see how dialogue truly can solve all problems. Because when you get down to the foundation of most problems, you realize that we all want the same things. We truly all want the same solutions. It's just how do we get there? And I've learned that a collective response to challenges and problems and issues ultimately helps both parties or all parties involved, come up with win-wins. So that's what I like to push on this show, and I like to kind of take a moment before each show to kind of talk about that with the hopes that, it'll help our listeners and us in some way. So what is Race Haven? Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. So here's the framework for authentic dialogue on this podcast. Number one, participants listen with a sense of curiosity and ask questions to uncover the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind someone's statements. Okay? Number two, participants are willing to communicate their thoughts openly and honestly while putting aside emotions, defensiveness, and the desire to be right. Number three, participants approach someone who sees a problem differently, not as an adversary, but as a colleague in common pursuit of better solutions. So, while we have this dialogue that we're going to have today, and if you've listened to previous dialogues, things get heated sometimes, and that's okay. That's normal. But as long as we always default back to our framework, which is authentic dialogue, then we're all moving together in the same direction. We're going to put forth our best thoughts. We're going to communicate without being defensive, and we're going to ask questions to get to the underlying assumptions behind someone's beliefs or statements so that we all can grow. So, with all that being said, welcome to the dialogue. So, John and Montoya, are you guys ready?
Yes, ready to go.
Absolutely.
All right.
Looking forward to it, my friend.
Awesome. Well, let's do it. So, at the end of last week's call, we kind of started down a path on a concept of personal responsibility. And I immediately wanted to bring it back because I knew that there were several levels to this, and I wanted to really get into it and explore several layers and the nuances behind the argument of personal responsibility versus some of the systemic issues that we talk about. Whenever I'm having dialogues on social media or just reading other dialogues based on race and social media, a lot of times I'll hear some people, I'll read where some people will say, well, that's not a systemic issue, that's a personal responsibility issue. And you're laying the blame and pointing the finger at others where these people are getting in trouble because of the individual choices that they make, i.e., they may be bad people, etc. So one of the best ways, and I think is a good place to start, is talking about our prison system. So I'm going to bring back something that I spoke about last week as a place to start, and then I'll jump to our guest co-host to kind of give some feedback. But I think this is a perfect place to start. So I'm going to read a quote that I got from an article where, on sociology.about.com, where the sociologist breaks down the concept of racial projects in the same article that she also discusses systemic racism, etc. So politically, and this is, I'm quoting now, politically speaking, neoconservative racial projects deny the significance of race, which produces colorblind racial politics and policies that do not account for the ways in which race and racism still structure society. For example, legal scholar and civil rights attorney Michelle Alexander demonstrates in her book, The New Jim Crow, how the seemingly race-neutral war on drugs has been waged in a racist way due to racial biases in policing, legal proceedings, and sentencing, all of which result in the vast overrepresentation of Black and Latino men in U.S. prisons. This colorblind racial project represents race as inconsequential in society and suggests that those who find themselves in prison are simply criminals who deserve to be there. It thus fosters the common sense notion that Black and Latino men are more prone to criminality than are white men. This kind of neoconservative racial project makes sense of and justifies a racist law enforcement and judicial system, which is to say, it links race to social structural outcomes like rates of incarceration. Now, in contrast, liberal racial projects recognize the significance of race and foster activist-oriented state policies. Affirmative action policies operate as liberal racial projects in this sense. An example, now that ends the quote. Now, an example I want to bring to the forefront of a liberal racial project is recently President Barack Obama has been pardoning several thousand non-violent offenders, and more so than anything, federal drug offenders. He's been commuting their sentences, and that's an example of what would be called a liberal racial project. So as I'm reading, the comments under articles like this, and you have people who, if it's a conservative news outlet, a lot of times the people will speak to, again, bad people commit crimes, so they go to jail. It just so happens that more African American and Latino people are the people out there who are bad and committing crimes. And a lot of times they don't see anything other than that, whereas the liberals will say, well, hold on, it's because of racist policies and things like that that we see this overrepresentation. So again, a lot of times the conservative view of saying it's all about a lack of personal responsibility, and then you have on the liberal side people saying, hold on, it's about systemic racism. So I'd like to start there and talking about our prison industrial complex and the issues that we see there, and get our guest co-host thoughts on how does personal responsibility versus the systemic issues play a part in this. So I guess we'll go with you first, Montoya. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of Michelle Alexander. This is an area that that's a soapbox issue for me that's very serious due to the fact that, being an African American, seeing how devastating it has been on our community, not only where I'm from, but just throughout the country. And the reality is, and I don't know that America literally wants to own this, but the reality is, not just in America, but anywhere around the world, where you see over-policing and lack of job opportunity, the results are always the same. They're always the same. But if you you study within the country or study other countries and look at what's being said about those communities that are overrepresented in the jail system, again, whether this is America or you can go to the Philippines or you can go to India historically. I mean, there's so many places you can go, and if you are able to do any research on what's being said in the media, whether it be written, whether it be TV, whatever type, the media, there's a understood concept, this area that's, in a sense, with the lack of opportunity, that's over-policed, that is necessary because there's these large amounts of crimes that are being committed in this area. So we're only doing what's necessary based on the individual's acts. That is a common thread that you see throughout this country and historically throughout other countries and currently around the world. The human nature, regardless of race, ethnicity, or culture, will respond to a lack of job opportunity and over-policing the exact same way. That's the one thing that has been consistent. If you create opportunity and police on an equal basis, then human nature takes back over and you don't see the extra crime. That is something that has been consistent. But when you're on the outside looking in, listen to what the media may be writing or saying about this group that's looked upon. This happened to the Irish in this country for a long period of time when they were overrepresented, I keep saying that word wrong, I'm sorry, overrepresented in the jail system prior to our time, in a sense, coming out of Reconstruction. The Irish represented anywhere from 70 to 80% of this country's jail system. And the same things was being said in this very country about the Irish. But when they were allowed to acquiesce into society and the target became the newly freed African Americans, then they were able to acquiesce. They wasn't policed. They wasn't hoarded into certain sections of the cities. When that stopped happening, then they no longer overrepresented the jail. They didn't become less criminal. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let me jump in and ask you this. So what do you say to the people who will say, well, the reason why these neighborhoods are quote-unquote over-policed is because they're over-crime-ridden?
Yeah, the answer is very simple. Again, as I've already said, around the world, anywhere that you go, where there's a lack of jobs, you're going to see high crime and high pollution. It's standard anywhere in the world. We can go to the least dilapidated places in Europe right now that are considered the bad parts of town. You're going to see high crime and high pollution. And you know what else you're going to find? Very little job opportunity. It's consistent around the world. So that's what I say.
Okay. Okay. So, John, what are your thoughts about what we're discussing right now?
Well, I appreciate both perspectives when you laid it out there, and obviously I enjoy listening to Montoya because he brings a great perspective and obviously is tremendously educated in this area. I'm going to simply toss something out there that I think is my best attempt at basically describing what I mean by personal responsibility. It's personal choice. And what I mean by that is it goes on both sides. I don't doubt for 1 second that it's a real reality that there's profiling that goes on and that, from law enforcement side, there's a heavy prejudice. And as Montoya said, it can shift from one group to another based on many different elements. But as much as I acknowledge that personal prejudice in law enforcement does exist, there's also a personal choice on the other side of the fence. And I can just remember hearing different people throughout, my years and their perspectives. I personally have zero interest in ever ending up in jail or prison. I wouldn't last there. It's not something I want to do. But I do know people that don't have that same concern or fear. Their attitude is, screw it. They have no respect for law enforcement, and they have no fear of going to jail. So those two things are what I mean. When I talk about personal responsibility and personal choice, we have the choice. We as individuals, whether we're individual citizens or if we're involved in law enforcement, we have the choice whether we're going to be straight up and honest and down, right down the line, or if we're going to be prejudiced and we're going to bring our own personal agendas to the table. And I think it's those two things combined, when I say personal responsibility, that create that big divide and that big mess. So I agree with you, Scott, that whether you're looking at a conservative or a liberal view, you're going to get a personal agenda, and that's what I mean by personal choice and personal responsibility. That's the mess. The simple, little joke example is, take some boiling water, drop an egg in it, you get a hard-boiled egg. Drop a potato in it, and you get a soggy potato. It's not the water, it's what the water does to you. And so for me, personal choice has been whenever, and I'm still to this day right now dealing with all kinds of challenges and issues and frustrations. It's my personal choice to stay the course, to be as honest as I can, to work as hard as I can, or to say, you know what, again, screw it. I'm going to take shortcuts. I'm going to cheat the system. I'm going to get mine. But it's my personal choice that I don't want to ever be that person. I don't want to be viewed as that person. I don't want to be an example of that person. That's what I mean by personal responsibility and personal choice. And we can apply that to everything from the prison system to work to relationships, you name it.
So, okay, John, this is something that's tough for me because, I am a systems thinker, meaning, it's something that admittedly I've done a lot of research and studying on, and I know that most people haven't, because it was through my doctoral program that I was introduced to these concepts. And, one of the things I like to say, and when I'm thinking, is that the more I learn, the more I realize I didn't know. And also the more I learn, and I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way, but I'm just going to be honest, the more I learn, the more I realize that other people don't know because I didn't know it. And I consume a lot of information, a lot of books, but we all have our interests. We all have the things, let me say it like this. No one can know everything. That's really the best way to put it. I don't look down on people for not knowing certain things because, no one can literally just know everything. So that's why I'm always kind of miffed when I see people having debates as if they do know everything, and rejecting, facts and figures from people who do specialize in certain areas. So with that being said, there's been a lot of research done on this issue. So while you would say, and while I would agree that, I'm going to navigate this world, it is my personal choice to navigate this world in a way that will not put me in a position to be put in prison. I'm going to make good choices. I'm going to, try to do, be respectful, et cetera, et cetera. While that sounds, and it makes sense and it's logical in every way, there's some people who grow up in certain environments where they are literally like being preyed on. So, for example, there's an article at AmericanProgress.org, and it's called The Top 10 Most Startling Facts About People of Color in Criminal Justice in the United States. And the number one is while people of color make up 30% of the U.S. population, they account for 60% of those in prison. So what I say to that is, if minorities in general make up only 30%, why are they 60% in prison? I feel like if we really sit and ask tough questions of ourselves as Americans, no matter what your political affiliation or, whatever, if we really ask tough questions and really get down to the root, you got to ask yourself, why are those numbers so disproportionate? And there's some other numbers which is really scary. 1 in 3 black men can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. 1 in 3. That is ridiculous. But then when you start to look at the trickle-down effect of not having men in the household, not having men in the community because they're going to prison, because their microaggressions may ultimately lead to them being imprisoned, whereas the same microaggressions that people, European Americans commit, or micro crimes or whatever they commit, they aren't being punished the same way. So therefore, they're not the dent and the pain and all those things and the residual effect on the negative residual effect on the community is not the same. So to give you the statistic about that, let's see. It says that Once convicted, black offenders receive longer sentences compared to white offenders. The U.S. Sentencing Commission stated that in the federal system, black offenders receive sentences that are 10% longer than white offenders for the same crimes. So there's so many more statistics, and I know Montoya will be able to add some more context to that because this is an area of focus for him where we see these disparities. So what I struggle with, John, is I struggle with how we balance that individual responsibility where someone like yourself and I, who may have a different level of consciousness and awareness based on the way we were raised, than someone who's growing up who was born into, let's just say, born into the wrong family, born into a situation where dad wasn't in the household because dad was already wrapped up in the system. So now the kid sees all the stress and anguish of being in that household with a single mother who may not, who may have some issues herself, because of the stresses of poverty. And then all the pressures in the surrounding neighborhood, and the people who take you in are those people who are out there committing crimes, et cetera, et cetera. And now you fall into this cycle. So whose responsibility is it? Is it, whose responsibility is it to help break those cycles when we see a system that's designed to where people are actually profiting off of these social ills and poverty, et cetera, because of our, for-profit prison system that we have nowadays that has also helped to, increase the rates of minorities going into prison because it's prison for profit nowadays. So, we have all these issues. So where I hear personal responsibility, what I struggle with is how can we find a balance to acknowledge both? So either one of you can jump back in.
Let me just real fast. I agree with everything you just said, Scott. And the reason I said it the way I did was I do believe it's on both sides. It's not. I don't live in an either-or world, and no one else should either, because it's never either-or. The point you just made is exactly it. There's a lack of education and a lack of example. And I don't say a complete lack of education and a complete lack of example because, yes, in a fatherless home, lack of example now means where are these kids going to learn from? And in your point, yeah, could it be that the father's already in the prison system? Absolutely. But could it also be that the father just is absent? Because, again, we all, me, you, Montoya, and every man has a choice. If we're going to go out there and decide that we're going to procreate, we have two choices. Be responsible and be a father to that child, or be irresponsible and have 10 kids with 10 different women and not be, present in any of their lives. So that's what I mean by personal choice. It's a combination of both. I'm not discounting that the system absolutely wreaks havoc on it, but there are also people who contribute to that. And then the last point that I'm going to let Montoya jump in is the education. It's not just a white-black thing. It's an education. It's a systemic in our entire society. Go to a poor white area, okay, and give kids a choice. Work hard at some menial labor job, or run drugs, or run moonshine, and you know what? Lack of a good example, they're going to take the shortcut, and they're going to end up crossing the line and literally breaking laws and going to jail. Does that mean
John,
that's the only reason?
Unfortunately, John, unfortunately, the last example, that's an assumption that's quite often made that unfortunately isn't the case. In the sense of, are there, absolutely, do we have pockets of white people who are very poor in this country? Absolutely. That part is very true. But people make the assumption that you see equivalent prison arrests and prison rates in those communities, and the truth is you don't. So it's just an assumption.
I agree with you.
It's just an assumption that they're making that choice when the reality is they're being policed different. Period. You just said that they'll make the same choice in that scenario, but we're not seeing the same prison rates when they are making the same bad choices that's happening in other communities. They're not going to prison the same. So what is it? Is it they're making the same bad choice, but they're not going to prison the same? So I'm just being honest to you about it is,
right, well,
unfortunately. Go ahead, brother.
Let me throw myself in there because let's use me as an example. I've gone through a number of periods in my life where I was flat broke. Not even my choice, not even my responsibility, not even my fault, but faced with real financial struggle. I've had the same opportunity to go out there and get involved and run drugs and do things illegally to make money. And you know why I did? And I'm not even going to say it's because I'm some choir boy good guy. I said, you know what? The potential of going to prison far outweighed my willingness to take the risk. So I said no. So I stayed the course. I have a very healthy, real fear of prison. Right. So that right there was my personal choice. It had nothing to do with even whether or not I was going to get caught. I wasn't willing to take the risk. So I'm not discounting what you're saying. I'm 100% in agreement with it. But I'm also saying we can't just say that's the only reason because it had nothing to do with whether or not I got caught. It had to do with the fact that before attempting it, I said, hell no, I don't want to run that risk. So we need to have that education. Let's call it a very healthy fear. That's what I'm trying to throw in here to say it's not all one or the other, but we have to admit this it did in my personal responsibility, and I'm sure there's plenty of other people that having that healthy fear are going to just say it's not worth the risk. I'll do some, labor job and bust my tail and figure out another way. That's all I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Right.
Let me. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and there are people, and I'll let you jump in really quick, but I want to say there are plenty of people, because I grew up in the environment in inner city Philadelphia where I got a chance to see people making those choices. And I think a lot of times, for whatever reason, as Americans, we've been conditioned to think in stereotypes. We've been conditioned to think in polarization. We've been conditioned to literally think black, white in terms of situations, like it's either this way or that way. However, we haven't, for whatever reason, we haven't had an opportunity or been conditioned to think through complexity. So, for example, and also because America is still so segregated, it's so easy to believe in these things. It's so easy to believe in these various stereotypes. So with that being said, there are plenty of people who grow up in these environments, some who grew up literally in the same family where you had people making the choice of saying, I won't stand, I won't last a day in prison. That's not the life I want for myself. So I'm going to go out here and I'm going to work at McDonald's and work my way up and go to the military, et cetera, where their sibling will be a drug dealer, or someone out robbing people and committing crimes within the same family. So, there's just so much complexity. There's so much nuance, and there's literally, there's no absolute. It's no absolute in this, as individuals. So that's where I hear John saying, you know what, it comes down to individual choice because you have two people in the same family making two different choices. However, on the flip side, I hear Montoya saying, however, the problem that we have in America is this. If you take that same scenario I just gave with an African-American family versus a European-American family, the European-American family in American history has had way more chances to make those mistakes but get another chance to get it right. Whereas African-Americans have been literally had the book thrown at them for making the same exact choice, which then goes on to impact their family generation after generation a totally different way. Go ahead, Montoya.
So what we tend to do, and this is human nature, we kind of overvalue how we gather our own value system, and it's natural. You're coming from your own perspective. So what happens? The funniest thing about us being divided in any area, whether it be religion, racial, any kind of way, class, however we want to be divided, the funniest thing to me that I always speculate on is this idea of how the heck do we even create these differences when we literally have to be taught as humans to clean ourselves, to wash ourselves. So I'm talking about something as simple as being cleanliness. Historically came from once we started staying together, living in together, and being in close proximity, and disease came from it, and humans had to say, well, we got to do something different because us being unclean makes this worse. But by nature, as a kid, you don't want to take a bath, you don't want to take a shower. Your parents teach you to wash yourself. And so I give this example to say the idea that you're in a position to make this personal choice came from a value system that you might have come up in an environment that helped teach that. So when Scott gives the example, when you say, yes, in the very same household, you have one kid that decides to go to McDonald's and work his way up, and one kid decides to become the drug dealer. Well, the reality is, if you live in an environment in which those choices are abundant, the bad choices are abundant, and you put a bunch of kids who are learning how to be adults. You know, a lot of us make bad decisions as teenagers. If you live in a certain neighborhood, you can recover from it. You live in another neighborhood, maybe you don't recover from it. It could be something as simple as underage drinking. I wasn't an underage drinker, but most of my friends were. In my little town, you can survive that. There are some places that alone can start a long, lifelong process for a child. So anyway, I say all this to say that as I want to reference back to what happened to the Irish. They didn't start making better personal choices to stop going to prison. That's not what happened. They were no longer the targets. So it's not that I'm dismissing personal choice, just as I said on the program last time. You and Scott, you and I have been in the programs together. If and you teach kids, I counsel kids. So again, when you and I are speaking to kids, the only thing we're talking about is how to make better choices. And the reason we're talking about that is because we know that in some of these environments, they're not getting taught that enough. So we're overemphasizing personal choice. It's the only thing that we speak to. So there is no way that I'm being dismissive of personal choice. But what I am, I'm not trying to make it an either-or thing, but unfortunately, as I said on the last show, that the time spent contemplating on personal choice, which is how I speak to the kids when I speak to them. But again, because we know they're not getting enough of that. But the time spent on it, it allows, in my opinion, America to get off the hook on why the very example that John spoke to on this show. Because when I asked you, John, what's the difference in that poor white neighborhood and them making those bad choices, and you said, well, let me tell you that I wouldn't make that choice. Well, the question I asked you is, while those white poor kids may be making the same poor choices, they're not getting wrapped up in the system. That's the question I asked you. What about that? Because you said they're making the same bad choice. What I'm saying is we don't address the system. The way that you address it is not to say make a whole bunch of more poor choices when we see around the world over police, lack of job opportunities, humans act the same. You always have those who are exceptions who come out of that scenario, but the numbers always end up being the same. There's never been a system. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I agree with you, and if I did not make that clear, let me make it clear right now. I agree that we do have to address the system. I do agree that there needs to be, on the law enforcement side, on the political side, a much better balance, let's just call it less prejudice. But again, to Scott's point, and obviously to your point, how do we get there? I'm open to solutions to getting there. I'm just speaking, as both of you have done when you counsel children, I'm just making sure that for the listeners of this show, that we have to acknowledge it is a work in progress from all angles. It just can't be, well, we talk about personal choice over here, so we're not going to address it here, because I can say from the other side of the coin, I don't hear enough people talking about personal choice, and the media certainly never mentioned personal choice, which sadly is where most people get their education today.
Well, see, so what it is, though, this is why I think when you say from the other side you don't hear enough about personal choice, I think you're just literally just going by what the media is telling you. I've never experienced in my lifetime of helping these kids, I've never witnessed, and if you haven't been a part of trying to help kids in these, and I'm not saying you have, I don't know if you have or have not, but I've never went to an event that focused on what's happening to you in the system. Like, I've never seen that happen. So if people believe that, it's only because when we say the other side, we're talking about the politics of it. I care less about the political rhetoric, but I've never seen, for example, that when you actually go into the places where we're having high crime, I've never seen one group focus on anything but personal responsibility. So if you don't think it's happening, you're just talking about political rhetoric. I'm just being honest with you.
I'll speak this way then. I have nothing to do with political. I've been a sales trainer in home-based business for 3 decades. So I've dealt with white, black, Hispanic. I've dealt with male, female. I've dealt with young, old. I've dealt with every segment demographic out there. And my frustration and the reality for me is that most people have a very bitter entitlement mentality. And I'm talking every race, every gender, every age bracket. This society has conditioned people for the last decade plus to have this, entitlement. And so that's what I'm speaking to. There are too many people out there. When I say there's no personal responsibility and they don't take personal choice, too many people feel the world owes them something and they're not willing to work. They feel they've been wronged. So that's where my point comes from. I could be just as bitter. I could sit back and blame as many people as anyone else. I'm trying to teach people that right or wrong, that's not going to get you where you want to go. So my point was not listening to the media. I think the media is poison. I think the media has absolutely perpetrated and perpetuated just horrible stereotypes and continue to divide us as a society. But that's not what I'm speaking to. I'm speaking from literally counseling and training over 1 million people the last 30 years. That's my message.
Okay,
let me jump in.
Ask this.
Let me jump in really quick.
One quick question, just one quick question, please.
Okay.
So when we're saying that on this show, we're talking about the racial issues that you acknowledge, and I appreciate you for acknowledging them. What I want to understand is if we have a situation, which, for example, where the police is over-policing a community, I still want to understand how an entitled mentality helps change that scenario. How does that do anything to affect improving that neighborhood?
Well, that's a hypothetical. In a specific example, I guess we'd have to look at, are there any African-American individuals in law enforcement? And if it's yes, what are they doing? If it's no, why are they not? Meaning, to me, the choices go back far beyond the results that we're talking about. We're right now, obviously, very focused when we talk about statistics on the results of things. I'm a math guy. My math background says we got to go past the results and figure out how we got here. And again, it goes back to where you guys had both mentioned. Take the same family. Take, 6 kids in one family. Is there anyone growing up thinking, you know what, I want to be a cop and I want to make a difference versus I hate the cops because, they're all prejudiced? That's, to me, where we have to go to the solutions. And then it goes back to what's the message in the household, what's the message in the neighborhood? Because you can take families that, have a deep, and I don't want to get religious, but that have a very deep religious affiliation, and they go to church every Sunday together, and they pray, and they're very, God-fearing people. They could be in the middle of a bad environment, but stay very focused, away from the illegal activities to where, just again, that kid is now going to be facing that peer pressure in the neighborhood that every day, if you don't join us, we're going to make your life a living hell. Those are the things that we have to get to in order to change the statistics. And that's why I'm saying it's a much bigger issue that includes the systemic problem as well as the personal choice. That's all.
So just to jump in really quick, because I didn't do this at the beginning of the show, and we always have new listeners, just to add context in terms of our backgrounds. John Costino is European-American, and Montoya Smith and myself are African-American. John is from the Northeast, New Jersey to be specific, and Montoya is from South Carolina, and a small town in South Carolina, and I'm personally from West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So just to add some context to our backgrounds, I think that's important for our listeners because this is a show that deals with race. So with that being said, I appreciate both of you, digging in on this topic and, realizing from listening to you both, it's, again, I just realized, how tough this work is and how there's so many variables and there's so much nuance that goes into it. Just to speak to something you said really quick, John, yeah, there's plenty of African-American people who are police officers, plenty. And the fascinating thing is, again, systems thinking is a whole level of theory. And side note, when I started school one day, I'm going to teach it, because if kids understand this as they grow up, then they'll have the capability of changing things. So let me just tell you how tough the system is, breaking through systems. Every issue that you hear African Americans or any minority or even European Americans who are awakened to these realities speak to in terms of when we're talking about criminal justice and the law enforcement, in terms of how they're over-policed and the brutality and the targeting of minorities from the system, that same applies to the people who are minorities that go into the system. Mm-hmm. They then begin to enact the same I can't think of inequities or the same, misuse of force against other minorities because of the system's pressure that they feel once they're in the system, which is just bananas. And then then if they fall in line with the systemic norms, they get protected by the same systemic norms. So these are stories I've personally heard from police officers, one of which is going to be on the show soon, who's an African-American police officer, who's a member of the Race Haven Facebook group, who speaks to these things and has told me separately outside the group that when he was a police officer, he saw how if African-Americans spoke up against some of the system inequalities, they wouldn't get back up out in the field. They would get blackballed. They would get shunned. And he said they better be careful if they ever approach a situation when they're not in uniform, because they might get taken out. I mean, this is from a police officer. The fear that he and other police officers have for speaking up against other minorities, not just minorities, and also European American police officers who speak out against the system inequalities, they are in fear. Some of them have written books that are in hiding today. There's several out there. So, I mean, the system is just so screwed up, and it's almost where I feel it's so corrupt. It's so screwed up to the point where at times I feel like, am I crazy for speaking out against it? And having a platform like this to speak out against certain things.
We all are. This is career suicide in business, but I think it's worth the risk. I think it's worth doing.
I agree. And as a businessman, I think about that sometimes, to be honest. I think about, will someone, take a snippet from one of these shows and use it against me, one day in some of my business endeavors. But like you said, I'm willing to take that risk because I care about people. So let me just throw something out there.
Let me say, go ahead. I've had the exact same scenario. I do the mental dialogue talk show on Blog Talk on Saturdays, but that's my second run doing mental dialogue. And the first time I did it, I remember I did a show where I brought on a 25-year veteran of the police department and talking about ways to improve the relationships with police in the community. So, it was a very informative show, teaching people how to make complaints and again, to get away from this mentality that we don't need police, because we absolutely do need police. So we had that show. Well, I ended up having a scenario that happened some months later after that show that was very upsetting for me, and where some police misconduct had taken place. I was very upset, so I talked to my friend. I said, well, we need to address this. And he was like, well, I'm not going to address it, and I suggest that you not address it. And I said, well, no. And I said, so we went real in depth, long conversation. And I said, and once I talked to him, I said, well, based on everything I'm hearing, this is being upheld by the quote-unquote good police by not speaking out, and I'm going to speak to that. He literally begged me not to do the show. I'm still building my listenership. I didn't, now I'm on maybe 300 a month. But at the time, I didn't have that large of a listenership. But he was very afraid and literally begged me not to do the show. He says, because you're doing positive things in the community, and I don't want a red flag placed on you, because your life in Atlanta can become very different if you speak to that issue. This is what he said to me directly. I still did it. I guess, like you just said, Scott, you don't know if they'll ever go back and get the tape. You know what I mean? I don't know if that ever happened to me either, and I didn't have a large listenership, but he was afraid of me doing it when he knew I only had a small listenership. One other thing, if I could say this, to John's point, when you say going back to the history, it makes me smile because this issue of personal responsibility and systematic, again, I know that you're saying either, you're having an and conversation, which I love to have. You're not trying to have an either or conversation, John. But it makes me smile when you say go back to the roots. And I had to be respectful and let you finish. That makes me smile because, and Scott, I think you may agree with this, but I think you will. But that makes me smile because the history that I feel like America refuses to face when it comes to specifically this issue of crime in our larger metro areas. The area that when you get to the history of where it started, that's what we don't do. So when you say you want to get back to the root, well, the root is the same way it's always worked. You reduce people through housing discrimination to certain parts of the city. They become too big of a population for that small of an area. That alone is going to create some levels of scarcity. Then over time, property value drops. Over time, jobs move out because there's no reason to go there. And we get the same results that we're always going to get no matter who you hoard into that area. So when you say we want to get to the root cause, well, if that's the root cause, which is more systematic, because what's going to be the individual response when you put a bunch of people in that area? It's going to be the results that it's always been around the world, and then you're only going to have exceptions. The family, the religious family that you gave, you're only going to have exceptions. Scott is an exception out of his neighborhood. I'm an exception out of my neighborhood. That's always going to be the results. So, yes, I hear you willing to address the systematic issue and explore that, but the time spent on that is no time spent on the solutions of owning the reality that there's a target. John, I think you own it, but we need more people owning that this systematic issue is going to create the same results. You cannot have enough personal responsibility to overcome systematic targeting. No group of people in the world has ever been able to do it. So to speak to it as if you say, well, let's just have more people be more responsible, it's not going to work if you're being over-policed, period. It's the one way to guarantee that any group or culture is the bottom rung of a society. You just simply over-police them. That's it.
The system is heavy. The system is so heavy. The weight of the system is so heavy. When you say the system, I'm speaking of several systems, and it's so heavy. And you made a very good point, Montoya, when you said there's no amount of personal responsibility that will ever overcome the system or systems. Okay. And what I want to, and you spoke so well about how, I'm a exception. You're an exception. Certain people are exceptions. And, one of my good friends and I always speak to that. And, growing up in Philly, I felt like, as an adult, like I'm so lucky. I am so lucky that I escaped the ignorance of my youth. I am so lucky that my parents did everything they could to protect me and that I didn't fall into one of those statistical categories that so many of my peers did. And the scary thing for me is how lucky I was for that to happen. Because looking back on some of the choices I made, I could have easily been caught up in the system. But people will look at me today and they'll say, wow, he has his doctorate degree, he has a family, he has education, he's a businessman, he has a nice house, a car, all these things, right? It's like, and he made it, he's successful. But then I think back to people who started just like me, who made similar choices to the ones I made, but got caught up in the system or were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they never had an opportunity to escape the ignorance of their youth. And then I think about, like, you know, I hear like some older people who were once incarcerated, and I hear them speak, and I hear the wisdom, you know, and I hear the knowledge of their adult lives, you know, and their lived experiences, and I think, man, they could really contribute to society, but the system has their knee on their neck and says you can't get jobs because a felony on your your record says you can't get that good job. So now, when you have, because of the systemic racism and all these different variables that were responsible for putting such a large percentage of a particular group of people in prison in the first place, now you have these people coming back into communities, and they have the wisdom of their adult life now, but they don't have the system behind them to help them utilize it in the positive ways, and then you continue to get this perpetual cycle of, you know, criminal activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just another example of how the system is designed to cause chaos and not improve things, and it's despicable. And we need people to have the courage. Let me make this final point. I'll let you jump in, Montoya. We need people who are listening to this to have the courage. I don't care about your political affiliation. We need people who are level-headed to have the courage to speak up and start taking the action needed to start chipping away at these faulty systems and redesigning them and realizing that your success is not the end game unless everyone around you also has an equal chance at being successful. That's what I want to get out there to people, and I want people to have compassion. And one of my biggest frustrations is when people hide behind their ideologies. And if someone's, for example, conservative, because, you know, a lot of conservatives, not making a blanket statement, but a lot of conservatives that I dialogue with or I interact with or that I read their articles or their comments on, they act like these things do not exist. They act like these systemic issues, like the example I just gave, do not exist. They literally think that everything is personal responsibility. And I think that that's unfair. And I don't know how to get them to see it differently because some of these things don't affect them. But if you're listening to my voice, I'm hoping that at least you're thinking about things a little bit differently. Go ahead, Montoya.
And here's how I would juxtapose it to maybe, if they're listening, in a sense, people that feel that way or think that way. John, you not being one. I do want to say that I acknowledge you absolutely do address it, say that it does exist. But Scott is correct. There are a lot of people who keep assuming that it, in so many areas, that it doesn't exist, even though we have unfortunate results that clearly show that there's a systematic issue. But here's how I would juxtapose it. Juxtapose against not being a targeted group, then the going to jail for you become, that is the exception. That's the flip side of the system. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you're not in the targeted group, then when because again, you still have people that grow up in good neighborhoods and kids still go astray and end up in the system. But that is the exception on the flip side. So if that's not proof in the pudding, that the system, because unfortunately the perpetual cycle that we are failing to acknowledge, that history that started with very evident housing discrimination after the Civil Rights Act comes into place, and to the extent that this is a black and white issue, regardless of people that want to say that it's not. The reality is it is. So after the Civil Rights Act gets put into place, and we're technically going to be recognized as first-class citizens throughout the country, supposedly, the drug war starts. Housing discrimination. You get the Housing Act of 1958 that says equal housing is supposed to happen, and everything but that happened. And so you create an environment that, unfortunately, I'm willing to own that, yes, you have young kids, the same ones that you and I are mentoring or working on or counseling or whatever you want to call it. Do you have young kids who have not been taught how to watch themselves, have not been taught any level of personal responsibility? But I also know that when you take the generation every 10 years of starting and you go back from that point to now, I also know that they learn from a parent who wasn't taught as well. because unfortunately, our community, specifically in the African American community, were more intact before this false drug war gets started. Well, it takes over time, the bad apples become more bad apples, and eventually, exponentially, you create a situation where you have pockets. And you and Scott, you spoke to it brilliantly. You and I both know, even in the worst neighborhoods, it ain't the majority of people that are acting up. It's still a small pocket. But now that small pocket is big enough to create, let's own it, a criminal element in some of our larger metropolitan areas. But that happens systematically over time. And now we want to say, after the system has created this scenario, well, just tell them to stop commit crimes. Well, here's the reality. Here's a very reality in the system. There are more people in prison for marijuana possession than all violent crimes put together right now as we speak. Every study in America shows no group does drugs more than another. No group does. So, yes, the simple answer is don't ever touch the drugs. But you got a young man in one neighborhood that's going to jail for it. You got another young man in one neighborhood that never gets to make a youthful, ignorant decision and go on to have a prosperous family. So if you just keep letting that happen systematically, one group's targeted, one group's not. Well, if eventually more of those kids are targeted, then systematically you're going to have more people that come up without that chance. It wasn't that the other group was any more responsible as a teenager than the other group. They just had another opportunity. That's a reality.
Yep. Go ahead and jump in, John. What do you have to say about that? Because here's what I can because here's what I hear from my conservative friends. And Montoya kind of hit it. He says, just don't use the drugs. Just don't use the drugs. Like, and it's just, for me, it's like, okay, that's a simplistic answer, but that's just not reality. It's not reality. There's so many other human variables that cause people to do these various things and make these various choices. Some of which, again, we won't go into depth on this show, but there's mental health issues. There are certain mental, there's chemical imbalances that make people more susceptible to drug use and drug abuse, no matter your race, because of things like depression, et cetera, and there's a scale in that. So, I mean, there's so many. It's interesting because it's all interrelated, it's all interconnected, but we tend to fragment these things and not give them their due. And then like Montoya stated, one group gets criminalized for it, and the other group kind of gets a slap on the wrist, or they have family members who can cover up their transgressions with the proper finances and, let's say, counseling and rehab and different things like that. So, I mean, it's amazing. It's just so amazing on so many levels. And, my goal is that our listeners and people that we touch just start to think about things a little bit deeper, a little bit, in a little bit more of a broad way. John, you have anything you want to add?
Absolutely. And again, I want to be as crystal clear as possible. I'm not just acknowledging the systemic problem. I'm saying we have to solve it. None of my statements are ever to say that it doesn't exist or it's not important. It's essential. As a systemic problem, if we don't find a way to solve it, then we're just spending time right now. So my whole focus is always on how do we solve it. And that's why, I said earlier, it's career suicide, but I'm here because I'm more concerned about the world my son grows up in than the world I'm going to be dealing with. And so to that point, let's go back to something you said, Scott. Yes, you are successful. And I'm going to use this specifically to make my point. Do we just look at you and say you got lucky? It's me asking you a very real question. Do I just go, you know what? Scott was lucky. How does that make you feel?
It's definitely more than luck. Definitely. Let me. Yeah, well, it's definitely more than luck in terms of where I'm at.
I'm trying to disrespectfully say you had no part in it, that you were just lucky. That's 100% wrong. Fair statement?
Yeah, that's 100% wrong to say it was just luck.
Okay, so all I'm trying to bring up here, when I say personal choice, personal responsibility, is we can't say Scott Speed, who will very soon be Dr. Scott Speed was just lucky, or he was just an exception. We have to say, no, Scott made some choices, and he busted his tail to get where he got. Now, I'm acknowledging, oh, yeah, you had a hell of a harder road than a lot of other people because of the systemic problems, but you didn't just say, give it to me because I'm African American and you owe it to me. And that's what I'm trying to point out. And this is not a white-black thing, because I'm going to talk just about European American Caucasians that have that attitude that I want to slap out of their head that, no, the world doesn't owe you anything. I know people personally. Scott, you know I grew up in South Jersey and went to St. Joe's in Philadelphia. I had friends that when we went away to college, they ran drugs at Villanova University and got busted for it. And some of them went to jail, and some of them had their families buy their way out of it. It's wrong. It's 100% wrong. So I'm acknowledging, I'm validating what you and Montoya are saying, but I'm saying it's wrong. It does not belong. Now, that being said, the other end of the spectrum is we can't just say, give it to me, because there has to be a combination of both. That's the only point I keep trying to make is Scott Speed didn't sit back and do nothing and blame the system. He worked through it. And if more people get to hear that story, then we have more success stories. And to me, that's when we have enough people to start affecting change in the system. It's not going to happen with 3 of us, but it may happen with 300. It might take 3,000. But we have to start giving at least the education that, no, the system's broken, but we don't give up. We don't act spoiled. We don't act entitled. And we don't sit around bitter and pissed off. We actually dig in and we fix it together. That's what I keep trying to throw in there. That's all.
Okay, so I say those very things to every kid that I speak to. When you say he may have had a harder road, do you have any solutions to address why Scott had a harder road? Because what you're saying, I say, and that's why I have Scott Speed on my show. That's why I have doctors on my show. That's why I have scientists on my show, is because to expose, because they're not going to see it on TV. So what you're saying, I say every day. What do you have to say to the systematic issues that makes it harder for Scott to do it through his hard work and effort? Because we are aware. Do you have any suggestions?
It's wrong and we need to fix
right, I'm saying, do you have any suggestions in that area?
If I had the suggestions, we wouldn't be on this call. I mean, honestly,
you've been making it happen, right?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, because listen, you may not believe it, but I'm as pissed off about it as you guys are. I don't feel it's right. I don't believe in that injustice. And I do acknowledge that it not only exists, but it exists much worse for you than it does for me. It exists for all of us because I'll give you my perfect example of why it exists for me. We did a call or a conversation on white privilege and a whole other race podcast on that. But here's a fear I have, Montoya, and I've expressed this to Scott a number of times. Memorial Day weekend, the History Channel is going to run a new version, a new generation of the TV series Roots, which was very impactful. We all were alive. I believe you were old enough to see it the first time it came around. But it's going to come back, and I think it's a story that needs to be told. But I have the very real, healthy fear that it's going to negatively affect the wrong pockets in both the African American and European American communities and fuel an anger that doesn't belong in our society today. Not that the message doesn't need to be told, not that the history does not need to be, educated and experienced, but it's the negative effects of that information that are going to have a negative impact on our society that just doesn't belong. That's a real concern that I have, in that how do we share the message, how do we explain the problem, but without creating new problems right now today. That's when I say the system still affects me, because guess what? Whatever happens affects all of us. That's the problem.
So let me jump in.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I want to jump in because I really want to spend some time on solutions, and we let's go ahead and officially call this our solution segment. We kind of spend a little time each week on it, but today I want to take just a little bit more focused energy on solutions. And here's the thing. Here's what I know, John. First of all, I understand that fear, and it makes sense, and it speaks to a void and a need that I believe is one of the solutions. But let me say this: I know a lot of times in doing this work, there's people that get frustrated that just throw their hands up and they say, we could talk about it till our face turns blue, but there's no solution. It's never going to get fixed. But the reason why I do this work is I just don't think that way. I don't believe that way. I always think there's hope. I always think that we're moving towards progress. And what I hope this show will do is that for our listeners, we may say something that may spark the right mind that has the will and the strength and the resources to go out there and start chipping away at the long-term solutions in terms of breaking down these systems and having the courage to restructure them. So while we have this next few minutes dialoguing about solutions, I just want to encourage listeners to stay in there, to dig in and hold on, like sometimes in sports we say hold the rope, don't let it go, and continue to be optimistic and understand that progress can happen because, as I always use as an example, there was a time where people felt like slavery would never end. And if you want to go back longer than that, there was a time where people felt like, Europe would always reign and there would never be a new country called the United States of America. Or there was a time where people said, civil rights and Jim Crow will always exist. Segregation will always exist. And people fought back hard against these things. But yet these systems were broken. So if those systems were broken, we certainly can find the courage and the will, the strength and the resources to break down some of these other more nuanced and more complex that aren't as visual, like slavery and Jim Crow. Those were very visual, so we could see them and attack them. But then we have systems like when we talk about the police system and the corruption and the I believe it's called the Blue Shield or whatever it's called, and various other systems like poverty, et cetera. I think we can find the courage to restructure and beat those as well. So with that being said, yes, let's talk about solutions. Put forth your best thinking. Let's take the next few minutes for the three of us to put forth our best thinking on putting out some solutions to some of these fears and concerns that we have.
I'll start. Again, obviously this is an area that I study, but I'll say that when we have these conversations, people will always say, well, there's always going to be racism around and that kind of thing when we're having these conversations. And you just spoke to that people always thought slavery would be around. So that's why you're in this fight and in this battle and, as you say, holding the rope. And so while, unfortunately, some of those biases, will continue to pass down, but I think I've said this on the show before, but it gets less and less with each generation. That's why the newer generations are better than us when it comes to that. But here's an area of solution that I would love us to focus on, which is what's happening in policing. I always speak to it because I know how detrimental the over-policing and the siphoning of men specifically out of our community have led to some of the things that we're seeing in the African-American community. And so if we could get the country in general to acknowledge that the Blue Shield culture exists in police. Sometimes we kind of noted it, but we see a backlash when, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, you get this backlash of police lives matter. And so that is a direct, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a direct defense against what needs to change.
Right.
And so when I say in solutions, it's full acknowledgement of why, for example, in major cities, 85% of marijuana possessions, for example, are Black and Latino. Everybody smokes marijuana the same. You know what I'm saying? So until that, because here it is. If we're acknowledging it as a country, as a community, as a society, if we say it's a problem that the police doesn't police the same. If we all said that, then those same people could enter the police force saying, hold on, these systematic things that makes that Black officer or that Hispanic officer fall in line with the system because of retribution, we can get rid of the retribution if society agrees this is a problem. We have a disagreement as a society that is a problem, so the police force gets to continue to perpetuate a system because society feels this way. It's not the police. It's society that allows it to stand.
So do you have any ideas in terms of how we begin to chip away at that, Montoya?
Well, I mean, I think the fight for the Michelle Alexanders of the world, who's done way more work than I could ever do on this, is her putting out that book and asking for that acknowledgement, because I literally believe that acknowledgement absolutely changes it. I really believe that. You know what I mean? And it can't be the simple acknowledgement of, oh, I know that happens. That's not it.
Right.
If we can literally say some people are getting, and it's actually 20% higher prison sentences for the same crime. By the way, Scott, I know you said 10% earlier, but it's actually 20%. But again, because if you get rid of that element of over policing, now you can have families intact that can create values that doesn't create these issues we see in these cities. But without that opportunity, you always will be reduced to the bottom rung of society. So I really do believe complete acknowledgement of that this is wrong by society will force the police to fall in line. I do believe that.
I agree. And let me just say this. One, I had that book downloaded, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I'm looking forward to reading it. But let me say this in terms of solutions. I agree that we need to come together to work on that. And one of the things that, and I want to preface this in terms of Black Lives Matter, because that is their work. That is their mission. But one of the things that I feel like needs to happen is, and I appreciate anyone who steps up to take, to go after systems and take a stance and try to do things right. And I hesitate to criticize, but I'm trying to find the right words to say this. I feel like this fight cannot be done alone. I feel like these things need to be a collective effort. And just the simple name, the way that they named the group Black Lives Matter, has given ammunition to those who want to, fight against that. And they've given so much ammunition to opposing, mindsets. Just by the name, people are so focused on that name. It's amazing that there are literally pockets of people in America who think Black Lives Matter are terrorists. I mean, it's like it, and they believe it with everything in them. Like it's not even, hearsay. It's like that's what they believe. Right. Like they're a group of terrorists who only believe that Black people lives matter, and they want to wipe out everyone else. Like that's what they think Black Lives Matter is all about. And it's so amazing that happens in this country, and it is so real. But my thing is, how do we fight that? Like, how can we come up with a coalition of thought leaders to, come up with this mission? Because here's the thing. Some of these same issues impact poor European Americans as well.
Absolutely.
And in terms of in terms of how the criminal justice system comes down on their necks. And I've seen it, because I went to school in a community where there was a lot of, impoverished European Americans. So I've had an opportunity to really see that up close. And everyone's heard the story about that judge that was selling kids into the system, and he got, put away in Pennsylvania. That happened where I went to college. So, and a lot of those kids were poor, young European American kids who were getting sold to the system, to the prison system. So with that being said, if everyone could come together from different, cultural background, ethnic backgrounds, and come up with some, strong, unified push to start chipping away at that system, I think that would go a long way. But it just can't be an African-American thing or a Black Lives Matter thing. It has to be just any and everyone who gets impacted negatively should be able to buy into the mission and the vision, the name, the everything. And hopefully that will grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had this discussion before. We said specifically with Black Lives Matter. We understood from day one that it technically meant Black Lives Matter too, but we understood it naturally being African American, and there are a lot of people who are confused on it. So you definitely have to play get into a situation where you can create rhetoric that allows people to not have those misunderstandings, because then you spend time arguing back and forth over what does it mean versus, not even looking at the tenements. Because there's nobody that can look at the tenements of Black life. You actually look at the tenements, nobody will be in disagreement whatsoever, because it's all police directed. Every tenement is.
Yep.
Can I ask both of you guys a very simple question that again, I think speaks to what we're talking about as far as solutions?
Yes.
What is the difference, and why has it become, it seems, resistant to use all lives matter? Obviously, you guys know I'm not bigoted, I'm not racist, but to hear Black Lives Matter, to me, still seems, I understand the reason behind it. I'm not saying I'm ignorant to it. I'm saying that to the general public, it still seems divisive when choosing the word all lives matter brings us together. Does that offend you guys? Does that make sense to you guys? Is that one of the steps that we can make, at least for the people listening today, to say, you know what, let's stop using terms like black and white and just say all, if the goal is to solve it and bring us all together?
For me personally, I don't even like I don't like referring to humans as black or white, first of all. That's, and for anyone who's listening to the show.
I'm just saying
I know, John,
exactly.
Yeah, I know. I just feel like I have to preface it because I'm not just talking to you. I'm talking to people who are listening as well. So, and this might be the first show that some people listen to. So I want people to know that I personally don't like the term Black Lives Matter, and for that reason alone, because I don't like looking at humans as a color. That's just, one of my things. I believe in ethnicity. So with that being said, when I see Black Lives Matter, I just look at it as an organization. I don't really take it as that only Black Lives Matter, because I've taken the time to actually read their tenets and read their website, and it all just makes good common sense. But on the flip side, like I was saying before, where all lives matter makes sense, John, for me, I feel like it's a shame that we even have to have this conversation, because their mission is so needed and it is so necessary that I wish that we could focus on the mission. And that's where I would say, if I was having a critical conversation with the founders, I would encourage them to either change the name and restructure and continue to go forward after this mission, because they are spending way too much time, and other people who speak on these things are spending way too much time having to talk about, why all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. And there's been so many videos put out about why all lives matter is offensive. All lives matter is offensive because, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my message is, and I know it's not directly answering your question, John, but really my message is that I just wish we didn't even have to have the conversation, because we really need to focus on the issue. We need to focus on the issue that they're going after. So generally speaking, and I'll make this final point, but generally speaking, John, I believe that all lives matter, and I believe that the issue is not even, man, I hate it because it's not even what the whole thing is all about. It's like lives mattering. It's about police brutality and the misuse of force and the state backing it. Like, that's the issue. So
right, that is the issue.
That's the issue. I'm gonna leave it at that, because that's really how I feel.
The thing is, John, I don't know if you'll ever be willing to, but actually, Scott, you and I did a show on mental dialogue that said, should Black Lives Matter be changed to all lives matter? And now obviously you've kind of grown on your position, Scott. So I'll speak for myself. But to answer your question directly, what happens is, unfortunately, all lives matter, John, actually feels as dismissive as what we're currently going through. Dismissive meaning that, unfortunately, while police brutality happens, unfortunately, on all races, unfortunately, it disproportionately happens to African Americans. And so what happens is, when you say, well, let's just make it all lives matter, unfortunately, it's only used as a response to that the community is saying, hey, let's have the police stop over-policing us. Let's make sure that they're being fair in the way that they're policing. Well, it only comes out. Nobody activates or is taking any steps to ensure that the blue shield doesn't exist, the blue line doesn't exist. Nobody taking those steps. We're literally in status quo mode. Now that they've taken the steps to say this needs to stop, and I'm not necessarily making a defense of it needing to remain the name Black Lives Matter, but I'm hoping that you can understand that the response of All Lives Matter has never been a movement to do anything to address the police. It's just a response to people misunderstanding that the Black Lives Matter should have had 2 on the end. And not that would have fixed it all, but it would have made the clarification, because that's all that they meant, that this shouldn't be happening disproportionately. 1 in 3 black men going to prison. And you can imagine that when you see, for example, people that are getting out for things that didn't do it, that disproportionately is happening to African Americans as well. That's not the majority of people that's in prison. You know what I mean? But systematically, it creates this huge issue because of over-policing. So All Lives Matter just says, let's keep doing things the exact same way. That's the issue.
And the interesting thing is, let me make one more point really quick, John. The interesting thing is, when I see people, making a statement about All Lives Matter, this has literally become about lives mattering. Like, literally, that's what they're thinking. Like, they're thinking, like, but my life matters, and I'm not African American, and it's literally, that's what the issue is. So now in the public consciousness, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter versus Police Lives Matter versus, Blue Lives Matter or whatever, it's literally about the value of a human life mattering. That's like the blanket. That's how it's been, disseminated through society now, and it's totally taken over the true message. And that's what's saddening for me, because like, it's literally like my life matters, but it has nothing to do with my life matters, or I'm saying like this, has nothing to do with anymore that Black Lives Matter, meaning we should not be disproportionately abused and incarcerated and killed, and the person who does it getting off, etc., through the system. Like, that's totally been lost in all of this. But go ahead, John.
Well, no, let's just literally say then congratulations to all 3 of us, because we're bringing something to light that I will guarantee you a major segment of our population doesn't understand. And we're speaking to the root of it, which is, Montoya, by saying T-O-O at the end, you solved the miscommunication. You solved the frustration. And I'm being honest with you, because
I respect
again,
I understand that.
I didn't know the background of it. I just remember whenever I saw it, I thought, damn, why do they have to say black only? Because it's keeping us divided. I didn't get angry about it. I didn't go out there and riot on it.
I respect it.
As a neutral person, it just made me say, damn, they don't get it. That's a great message that just misses the mark. You add T-O-O, like you just said, and now I'm going, damn straight. Black Lives Matter too, and I'm all of a sudden behind it instead of confused by it. So if nothing else, people listening to this podcast are at least going to be better educated and at least have a better perspective. Maybe they'll go do some research. I know I will. And the beautiful thing is, if we can keep doing this kind of stuff and just opening up the door and removing the confusion, again, not that this is even a good analogy, but my background as a sales trainer, all I try to do is remove obstacles from people understanding and then having success in business, because when they don't understand something, or worse, they make a mistake, they go down the wrong rabbit hole, they can't be successful. That is a perfect example of not having 3 letters, T-O-O at the end, created a whole, as you said, Scott, a different rabbit hole that people are down and they don't even understand what the message was now. So honestly, thank you, Montoya, and thank you, Scott, because this now is very enlightening, and I just pray more people listen to this podcast and more podcasts to really go out there and get educated, because I think the more educated and, more importantly, the better we as a society communicate with each other, the less we're going to see differences, the more we're going to agree, and hopefully the more we can start coming together.
Absolutely. If I could just say, Brian, real quick to you, John, I appreciate you for your absolute willingness. That's where it starts. That's where the effort is. And as you just said, and that's one of the part of pledge that I have with the mental dialogue community is, ultimately we will find that we are still way much more alike than we are different. Now, one thing that we will ask as a minority, if this is something that I want to get out in the public as well, is we've made this mistake of shooting for this colorblind society. And there's another, I forget his name right now, but we should really be shooting for a color-rich society, because what happens is, in whatever minor ways that we are different between ourselves as humans, those are the things that quite often define some of us. Some people are not defined by those things, but whatever they are, if we actually would learn to make an acknowledgement of it and respect that person, we would be just fine. But we're so caught up in saying, well, we're all alike and being dismissive, and unfortunately, when you're in the majority, it's not even done intentionally. You just don't understand that you're being dismissive of something that some people may want to acknowledge. So anyway, I started to say that ultimately we're more alike than we are different. That's the ultimate thing, and I appreciate you very much, John, for your absolute willingness to stick it out regardless of where we may differ on an issue. I appreciate you for that.
Absolutely, you're welcome, and I feel the same way. I really do.
Well, okay, and just to add context, John, and for anyone who's listening, literally blacklivesmatter.com, and just read their principles, and you'll get further clarification and understanding of what they're all about. And hopefully that movement will continue to do great work, and maybe evolve to get their messaging to be able to beat the general messaging that's currently out there, or they'll evolve in a different way. But at the same time, again, I don't want to diminish, what they're doing, because it's so needed. I just wish that they had a different name, just for selfish reasons, but I totally respect, what they do, and I get it 100%. So with that said, I think, we've spoken to a lot of solutions. I want to put one other thing out there, and this is kind of big picture, big vision, but I'm not afraid to think that way. And, in terms of solution, it's something I've given a lot of thought to, but I'll just put it out there just in a snippet. But I think one of the things that will go towards solutions and everything we're talking about is something I've thought about, was acknowledging annually the abolition of slavery in America, acknowledging it in a major way on a national scale, so where it's a national holiday, not just an African-American holiday like Juneteenth, which currently exists, but a national holiday that all Americans acknowledge and all Americans celebrate. And just like we celebrate July 4th as our Independence Day, I think that we should celebrate the emancipation of slaves as an Independence Day, in the sense that this was the day that all Americans truly became independent in the eyes of the government. So with that, in the eyes of the federal government, or at least started to begin the process of breaking that that system apart. So and with that being said, I think it needs to be on a grand scale, to the point where there's literally parades, like the Macy's Day Parade that comes on national networks. There's like a large parade, and there's like panelists who are commentating the entire time, who are educated scholars, who are historians, sociologists, economists, and then regular people who annually educate Americans about our true history from the experts, people who spend their lives researching and studying this stuff. And they get on that stage, on that TV in New York City or in Times Square, somewhere on a major scale. And then there's pockets of these similar things happening all around the country, where, again, you have the experts, not the people who read the articles, but the people who write them, and not the people who write them from a place of, just family lore or what's been passed down, or their beliefs or their political beliefs. But no, the historians, the sociologists, the psychologists, the academics, etc., who this is their life's work. They come together and disseminate worthwhile information that helps everyone become educated in these areas, so that we can begin to heal the wounds that this country has. Because the wounds that this country has from slavery and white supremacy, it affects all of us. It just affects us in different ways. The frustration that some European Americans sense because of the African Americans who go out and protest and burn buildings or riot, et cetera, because of the anger and from being disenfranchised, et cetera, that frustration that they feel is a result of the same thing that is causing the people who are disenfranchised to riot or protest or do whatever. So we all need to heal from our past. And I think that we need a very direct and intentional, way of doing it. And that's just one idea of a solution. So unless anyone else has anything, I appreciate that, Montoya. Does anyone have anything else they want to add in terms of the solution? And, we're going to continue to do this in terms of spending a little bit more time on solutions from time to time. But with the hopes that it falls on the right ears. If I'm not able to lead it up one day, maybe someone who's listening is. So that's my contribution, and you guys have given your contributions to solutions. Did anyone else want to add anything else before we close out?
Other thing I would like to say, just how when I say I love it because if we did that hard look, it would be us as Americans looking at that hard history together saying, well, this was done so that we would be the same. So it will force us to do it together. So I love it. We would only, anybody that went against it would obviously not be trying to come together. But anyone else, in my opinion, that would be willing to look at that is we're only looking at this to be reminded, to know the true history, and say, we came together, let's make sure we continue to come together. That's how I look at it, and I think it would be very effective.
I agree with that concept. It's so positive when we can get both races together, unified in that type of a message. Like you said, Montoya, anybody that was against it would then obviously be the outside and the outcast rather than the majority. And I do believe that the majority of people would rather come together, unify, and live together in harmony. We just are so passive and quiet compared to the outspoken pockets that are trying to keep things divided. So I love it, and you've got my full support, as you know that, Scott.
Awesome. Well, one day, you guys know I have several projects, but just put that in the hopper because one day, God willing, we'll be able to get to that. So, man, that's our time for today. I want to thank everyone who's listened through to the entire show with us today. A special thank you to my guest hosts for the day, Montoya Smith and John Costino. I really appreciate you guys. I know that this is hard work. I know that it's tough to, where we put like this, we all have things that we could be doing to be chasing after, our visions of success, but to take time out to discuss something that impacts everyone, like race in America, something that's so hard, it takes a lot of bravery, and I just want to commend you for it. It takes bravery as well as time and energy. So I appreciate all of you both of you for, just being willing to give your time and your energy to this cause. I appreciate it so much. So would you guys briefly tell our listeners how they can connect with you and your work? So, John, I'll let you go first.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you to both you and Montoya. It's a pleasure to be here. And, again, it's very easy. You can find me on Facebook, John Costino, or email me at johncostino@yahoo.com. I love the philosophy. I love the whole purpose. And, again, Scott, anytime that you feel I can be a benefit, I'm always happy to be a part of this.
Thank you. Montoya?
Mine's very simple as well. Just go on Facebook and look up Mental Dialogue, and dialogue spelled the traditional way, not the, it's not this DIALOGUE. I know in the tech world people leave off the UE now. So Mental Dialogue on Facebook, and you can keep up with me there. That's the easiest way to contact me. And as always, every Saturday morning, I do an internet radio show called Mental Dialogue, dealing with some of these very issues, typically from an African-American perspective, but we absolutely welcome all viewpoints, even though the issue a lot of times will be focused on our community. That I definitely want to put that out there.
And where can they find your radio show, Montoya?
Okay, yes, blogtalkradio.com/Mental Dialogue 2. And that information is on the Facebook page. It's always the top post on the Mental Dialogue Facebook page, highlighting either the last show we just had or the new upcoming show that we have every Saturday morning. So if you ever want to check me out on a Saturday morning, you can go to the Mental Dialogue Facebook page and click on the top post, or go directly to blogtalkradio.com/Mental Dialogue 2.
Thank you. All right. So be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven Radio Show and podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio for our Android users, so that you never miss the dialogue. If you like the show, please leave
This episode of Race Haven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app. Five for Friends is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks because you both were so busy? Do you put off calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then Five for Friends is the solution. It's a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends. 5 minutes at a time. Visit 5forfriends.com or your app store to download. It's the number 5, F-O-R, Friends. Try it today.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
Introducing the 2016 Domino's DXP, a custom pizza delivery car with a built-in warming oven. That's right, a pizza company just made a pizza delivery car. Choose any 2 or more for $5.99 each. Medium 2-topping pizzas, specialty chicken, stuffed cheesy breads, or marbled cookie brownie. 2-item minimum, handmade pan pizza and bread bowls may be extra. You must ask for this limited time offer. Prices, participation, delivery area, and charges may vary. Participating stores and DXP availability may vary. Introducing the 2016 Domino's DXP, a custom pizza delivery car with a built-in warming oven. That's right, a pizza company just made a pizza delivery car. Choose any 2 or more for $5.99 each. Medium 2-topping pizzas, specialty chicken, stuffed cheesy breads, or marbled cookie brownie. 2-item minimum, handmade pan pizza and bread bowls may be extra. You must ask for this limited time offer. Prices, participation, delivery area, and charges may vary. Participating stores and DXP availability may vary.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 480p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers. Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figured out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 480p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.